The man known to history as Emperor Haile Selassie, I was born on the 23rd of July, 1892 in the town of Ejasa-Goro, not far from the city of Hara in Ethiopia. He was given the name Liege Tafari Makonnen in his youth. Liege simply means child of, while Tafari means one who is respected or feared. Makonnen was his father's name, and so as he was growing up, he was known as the child of Makonnen, who is greatly respected. His father, Ras Makonnen, was the governor of the ancient walled city of Harar in eastern Ethiopia, and a key advisor to his near kinsman Emperor Menelik II, who was emperor at the time. Thus, Liege Tafari Makonnen was born into a significant noble family, which was related to the current imperial dynasty. Through his paternal grandmother, Tafari was descended from the Solomonic line of kings who had ruled this part of Africa since the 13th century. Tafari's mother was Waizero Yeshimebeli, the daughter of a ruling chief from Wollo province to the north. Any exploration of Tafari's life must start by exploring the nature of Ethiopian society and the empire that ruled it in the late 19th century. Ethiopia and the wider Horn of Africa have a unique history. 1700 years ago, when the Roman Empire ruled all of North Africa, Roman Egypt emerged as a major early center of Christianity in the eastern Mediterranean. Soon the new religion spread south beyond the borders of the Roman Empire, down the river Nile and the coast of the Red Sea. It gained many adherents in what is now Ethiopia, which effectively became a Christian country. However, with the Arab conquests of the Middle East and North Africa in the 7th century AD, Ethiopia was effectively cut off from the rest of the Christian world, but it did not convert to Islam. Accordingly, over the centuries, a unique form of Christianity developed here, one which continued to adhere to many of the rites which were typical of the 4th century church. Moreover, Ethiopian politics and culture became shrouded in biblical legend, and from the 13th century onwards, the rulers of the Kingdom of Ethiopia claimed to be descended from the biblical King Solomon. Therefore, their dynastic line has become known as the Solomonic dynasty. The Solomonic dynasty ruled a kingdom which, centuries ago, only constituted part of northern Ethiopia. But between the 13th and 19th centuries, it began expanding to the south, west and east, eventually covering an area approximate to modern-day Ethiopia. As it did so, the Ethiopian Empire became a multicultural state, one which had many different ethnic peoples living under the rule of the emperors. The foremost of these were the Oromo and Amhara people, who between them made up over half of the population of the empire. But significant minorities included the Somalis in the far south and east of the country and the Tigrayans in the northeast. These different ethnicities spoke different languages and had somewhat different appearances. For instance, the Oromo are a Cushitic people who dominated the northwestern part of the country and had been more responsive to the spread of Islam into the region. The Amhara are a Semitic people who dominated the highlands of Ethiopia and were much more committed to Oriental Orthodox Christianity. These ethnic and religious divisions would influence Selassie's rule and indeed the entire history of modern Ethiopia. Indeed, so central are they to the country's history that the alternative name, which was used for the Ethiopian Empire at the time of Tafari's birth, was Abyssinia, from the Arabic habasa term for mixture, a reference to the multicultural nature of the empire. By the mid-19th century, the Ethiopian Empire had become one of the most powerful states in Africa, and it needed to be, for the great European powers were entering into a period of accelerated colonization of the continent. To the north, Egypt had effectively become a British protectorate, and British rule was being extended down the River Nile into Sudan, Ethiopia's western neighbor, and eventually into Uganda and Kenya, the southern neighbors of Abyssinia. To the east of Abyssinia, along the coastline of the Horn of Africa, a number of European powers acquired territory through treaties and military intervention in the years leading up to Tafari's birth. The foremost of these was the Kingdom of Italy, which acquired the colonies of Italian Somaliland and Eritrea in the 1880s, comprising most of the modern-day countries of Eritrea and Somalia. The British and French also carved out small enclaves in northern Somaliland, In the end, nearly all of Africa was annexed by the European powers in what has become known as the Scramble for Africa. However, Abyssinia avoided this fate, in large part because Emperor Menelik II, who came to power in 1889, began a program of modernization. He established Addis Ababa as a strong new capital in the center of the empire and developed an alliance with the Russian Empire from 1893 onwards. Through this, the Russians sent military advisors, scientists and economists to Abyssinia to advise the country on how to modernize its government, economy and military, with a view to withstanding encroachments by the Italians, British, French and others. Thus, when Tafari was born in 1892, a new era of Ethiopian history was beginning. As a son of a major Ethiopian noble, Tafari was afforded honors from a young age. For instance, when he was just 13 years old, he was given the title of Dejazmach of Garamulata, an administrative region near the city of Hara. Dejazmach literally means keeper of the door, and shows that he was a protector of sorts of the region while still barely a teenager. Yet there was little sign at this time that he would ascend to a position of imperial authority. For despite the fact that he was related to the imperial family, Emperor Menelik II had a clear line of succession in place. He had two daughters, Shoarega and Zuditu. Through these, Menelik had several grandsons, one of whom, Liji Iyasu, the son of Shoarega, was eventually designated by Menelik as his successor. Meanwhile, Tafari's youth also saw a concerted effort by the Kingdom of Italy to connect its two colonies of Eritrea and Somaliland by conquering Abyssinia. In 1895, the Italians invaded Abyssinia, but Emperor Menelik's modernization efforts proved beneficial, and the short-lived First Italo-Ethiopian War ended a year later in 1896, when an Italian invasion force of some 15,000 men were decisively defeated by a much larger Ethiopian army of upwards of 75,000 at the Battle of Eidara. With this, Abyssinia's independence was secured for a generation. In his teenage years, Tafari was promoted further within the empire. In 1907, for instance, he was appointed as the governor of the province of Sidamo in the south of Ethiopia. He sired a daughter during this time, the future Princess Romanwork, though the identity of her mother is not entirely certain. In 1911, he married Menon Asfar, also a member of the imperial family. This was around the time when Emperor Menelik II, who was nearing his 70th year, became increasingly more incapacitated due to a series of strokes he had suffered. He eventually died in 1913, leaving his 18-year-old grandson, Liji Iyasu, as the emperor-designate. Iyasu had been serving as de facto emperor for some time by 1913 on account of his grandfather's illness. Under such circumstances, this might have allowed him to solidify his position in advance of the emperor's death, but instead the direct opposite had occurred. Iyasu had found himself increasingly opposed by the Council of Ministers which his grandfather had established, and even by his own aunt, Menelik's younger daughter, Princess Zuditu. Thus, when Menelik finally died in December 1913, the Council of Ministers and the princess suppressed news of his passing and did not confirm Iyasu as the new emperor. He was left to enjoy some semblance of power in the months that followed, but his accession would never be proclaimed and he would never be given an imperial name. There were multiple reasons for this opposition to Iyasu. Firstly, in the final years of Menelik's reign, the young prince had shown himself disinclined to the kind of administration and management which was necessary for the ruler of a rapidly modernizing empire. Secondly, and more importantly, there were concerns that he was disposed to Islam over the Christian faith, which was central to Ethiopian political life. The latter issue was unacceptable to the Council of Ministers, and when rumors that Iyasu had converted to Islam mounted in the mid-1910s, they moved to depose him as emperor in the autumn of 1916. He was placed under arrest and would spend the rest of his life down to the mid-1930s in detention. Following his removal from power, Zuditu was proclaimed as Empress of Ethiopia. But with the succession now unsure, it was decided that her cousin Liji Tafari Makonnen, the future Emperor Haile Selassie, would be appointed as her regent and designated successor. Evidently, Tafari's tenure as a regional governor of several provinces in the late 1900s and into the 1910s had been successful, and he had weathered the political intrigue of the years of Iyasu's brief reign very well. Thus, the stage was set for Tafari to one day succeed Zuditu, who was entering her 40s when she became empress and did not have any other clear successor. In the years that followed, a clear delineation developed within the government of Abyssinia between Empress Zuditu and the regent Tafari. She was a traditionalist and a conservative ruler, while he was following the path hewn by Emperor Menelik II in wishing to modernize Ethiopia. In theory, the empress was by far the more powerful figure, but her position was weaker than any of her predecessors as ruler of Abyssinia for the simple reason that she was a woman in a society which prioritized male rule. As such, Tafari was able to claim a great deal more influence than would have been typical of the power dynamic between them in most other circumstances. Both had their factions. She was favored by the Ethiopian church, which looked kindly on her conservative values, while Tafari was supported by a clear majority of the Council of Ministers. Eventually, in the course of the 1920s, he emerged as the more powerful figure, and long before her rule would end, Zuditu had begun to withdraw from government and allowed Tafari to continue his modernization efforts in the 1920s. The modernization program, which was implemented in the 1920s, was multifaceted. Much of it centered on trying to modernize the government and administration of Abyssinia to make it more like those of the European powers. There was a precedent for this. The non-European power which had modernized most effectively in the 19th century was the Empire of Japan. It had done so by adopting Western methods and had thus resisted Western encroachments and established itself as a major power itself in the Far East by the 1920s. Abyssinia aimed to at least partially emulate this approach. Thus, a Western-style government was established by Tafari, one with ministers responsible for individual aspects of governance. In tandem, there was a move away from the feudal nature of Ethiopian government to a political system where individuals were promoted based on their abilities rather than their noble rank. As well as this, the military was further developed, building on Menelik's reforms with the establishment of a military college. Finally, Abyssinia applied for membership in the newly established League of Nations, a forerunner of the United Nations. It became a member in 1923, one of the few non-Western nations to ever become a member of the League. Even more significant were the attempted economic and social reforms which were introduced during the reign of Empress Zuditu and the regency of Tafari. Already the first electricity grids had been introduced to Addis Ababa in the mid-1910s, and this was expanded outwards in the 1920s. At the same time, efforts were initiated to begin linking the main cities with roads and eventually railway lines. The telegraph and other communication systems which had become commonplace in the Western world in the second half of the 19th century also finally arrived to Abyssinia, albeit in a limited fashion. The National Bank of Ethiopia was founded in 1927 to bolster the economy, and excessive lending rates were prohibited. Perhaps most importantly, the judicial system was overhauled with the Feder Negast law code, a legal system which had been used in Ethiopia for centuries and which imposed brutal punishments for moderate crimes, such as the loss of a hand for being found guilty of theft, was gradually phased out in favor of a Western judicial system based on elements of the civil and common law. But there was a major backward element to Abyssinian society which remained. Slavery was still widespread here, a century after it had been prohibited throughout much of the Western world. Tokenistic efforts were made to end this in the 1920s as the Western powers criticized the retention of the system in Ethiopia, but Tafari was unwilling to commit to any major efforts to eliminate it from Abyssinian society at this time. Meanwhile, Tafari's international reputation was growing, and by the end of the 1920s, he was increasingly viewed as the face of Abyssinia on the world stage, rather than the empress. Much of this was owing to numerous trips abroad and state visits. For instance, in 1924, he undertook a tour of numerous foreign capitals and major cities with other members of the extended imperial family and the government. This was a fact-finding mission as much as anything else, as Tafari and others sought to gain from direct experience of the Western societies they were attempting to emulate. The Abyssinian delegation, with its ostentatious displays of wealth and court ritual, made a significant impression in London and Paris, where Tafari met King George V and the French Prime Minister Raymond Poincaré. Another significant goal of this foreign tour was to try to convince the British and French governments to provide Abyssinia with access to the Red Sea by surrendering some territory in its colonial enclaves in Somaliland. Elsewhere in the Middle East and North Africa, Tafari was greeted warmly as the all-but head of state of virtually the only African nation which had withstood European colonization in the 19th century. All of this ensured that before he would ever become emperor, Tafari was well established on the international stage. By 1928, Tafari's position at home in Abyssinia was such that the empress could not but promote him ever further. By this time, he had monopolized power within the Council of Ministers and, more importantly, had also moved to secure the loyalty of the heads of the military and police forces. Thus, on the 7th of October 1928, he was crowned as Negus, an Abyssinian title equivalent to a king, though still below that of emperor or empress. This replaced his earlier honorific of Ras, which had signified his position within the imperial line. In the months that followed, tensions began to brew between the empress's faction and that of Tafari, ultimately culminating in January 1930 in the outbreak of a borderline civil war between Tafari and Gugsa Well, the empress's husband. He not only wished to reassert his wife's authority within the empire, but now had designs of replacing Tafari as the head of the government and having himself crowned as emperor. Gugsa Well's rebellion culminated in a major meeting of his forces and the supporters of Tafari at the Battle of Ancam on the 31st of March 1930, but with their superior Western armaments and methods, which included the use of modern aircraft, Tafari's supporters quickly defeated Gugsa Well's army. He himself was killed in the fighting. Then, in a seemingly unconnected development, the empress died of natural causes just 2 days later, clearing the way for Tafari to claim absolute power in Abyssinia after years of dual rule between him and the empress. A mourning period of over half a year was imposed following the passing of Empress Zuditu. But at last, on the 2nd of November 1930, Tafari was proclaimed as the new emperor of Abyssinia and crowned that same day at the Cathedral of St. George in Addis Ababa. Emissaries from many Western nations attended the event, and Tafari featured on the cover of Time magazine that November. He also adopted a new name and title. The title he obtained was now Negusa Nagast, the King of Kings, while his imperial name would be Haile Selassie. Haile means power of, and Selassie means Trinity. So the name Haile Selassie effectively means the power of the Trinity. However, as we will see later, the former name he bore for much of the 1920s, Ras Tafari, was to gain currency again in later years and become increasingly well-known globally. More immediately, in the early 1930s, just after his accession as Emperor Haile Selassie I, the new ruler of Ethiopia quickly oversaw the introduction of Ethiopia's first modern constitution in 1931. This provided for the establishment of a bicameral legislature with a parliament and an upper house of lords with whom the emperor would share power. It was also intended that a new constitution would further lead to the end of the Feta Nagis legal system and its replacement with a Western judicial code. The first years of Selassie's reign as emperor were marked by his efforts to continue and expand the modernization program he had first initiated as regent in the 1920s. However, a shadow was increasingly hanging over Ethiopia. Back in 1922, the Italian government had been taken over by the National Fascist Party led by Benito Mussolini after the infamous March on Rome by 30,000 paramilitary fascist black shirts. One of Mussolini's great desires was to build Italy into a great power again, and to resurrect the empire Italians had enjoyed back in the days of Rome 2 millennia earlier. To that end, in the 1920s, he had engaged in a series of aggressive actions, initiating a brutal war of conquest in Libya, which had been a nominal colony of Italy's since 1912, as well as bombing the island of Corfu during a dispute with the Kingdom of Greece. annexing the city of Fiume in what is now Croatia and establishing a protectorate over Albania through a series of treaties in the mid-1920s. With these advances made in the early 1930s, Mussolini's attentions turned to the Horn of Africa, where he increasingly wished to correct what he deemed to be a historical failing of Italy's, its loss to Ethiopia in the First Italo-Ethiopian War back in the 1890s. If Abyssinia could be conquered, it would also make a continuous colony of Italy's lands in Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Italian Somaliland, in turn making it the predominant colonial power in the Horn of Africa. In 1934, tensions between Selassie's government and the Italian colonial administration in Eritrea and Somaliland began to flare over a long-running boundary dispute which had been caused by Italy's wish to build a railway line through the region connecting its two divided colonies, which Ethiopia was in the middle of. This had culminated in Italy building a military fort at Volwol in eastern Ethiopia. In December 1934, the Italian presence here was challenged by Selassie's government when Abyssinian troops were sent to Volwol. On the 5th of December, this led to violent engagements between the Italians and the Ethiopians, resulting in dozens of deaths on both sides. An international diplomatic standoff followed, now known as the Abyssinia Crisis. In early January 1935, Selassie's government protested to the League of Nations. Months of diplomatic toing and froing would follow, but essentially the British and French governments, who were best placed to act as intermediaries, were unwilling to block Italian aggression at a time when they were trying to win over Mussolini as an ally in Europe in the face of the rise of the Nazis following Adolf Hitler's seizure of power in Germany in 1933. Consequently, while negotiations followed for months, it eventually became clear to Selassie's government that the Italians were intent on using the Volwal incident in December 1934 and the ensuing diplomatic standoff as an excuse to declare war on Abyssinia, and that the League of Nations was not going to take any effective measures to try to stop Mussolini's aggression. The Second Italo-Abyssinian War commenced on the 3rd of October 1935 when the Italian general Emilio de Bono crossed over the border from Italy's colony of Eritrea into northern Ethiopia with tens of thousands of Italian troops. There was no formal declaration of war. This was to be one of the most significant conflicts globally during the interwar period between the First World War and the Second World War, eventually involving hundreds of thousands of troops and personnel on both sides. It would last for just over half a year. The sides were unevenly matched throughout, though. While the Ethiopians were numerically superior, despite the best efforts to modernize their armies since the 1890s, their forces were still resoundingly based on mass infantry divisions. For instance, Selassie's government had just a handful of tanks, and the Ethiopian Air Force consisted of little more than a dozen planes. By way of contrast, Mussolini's government was eventually able to deploy hundreds of tanks in East Africa, as well as massive artillery barrages and a significant Air Force presence. Thus, while the Italian army would be shown in later years to be enormously deficient in European terms, the war, which was initiated in the autumn of 1935, was clearly a David versus Goliath type conflict in which the Italians had the upper hand in a way which they had not back in 1895 when the First Italo-Ethiopian War was launched. In response to the invasion of Abyssinia, the League of Nations sanctioned Italy on the 7th of October 1935, 4 days after the initial incursion by de Bono's troops. The two primary countries within the League to whom the responsibility fell for challenging the Italian government's actions were Britain and France, who were the foremost colonial powers across the African continent and who had colonies nearby themselves in Somaliland and all across Ethiopia's western and southern borders, in Sudan and Kenya in the case of Britain. Yet while the Conservative-led national government of Stanley Baldwin in Britain campaigned on and won an election in November 1935 on the premise of supporting the League of Nations and its mission, Baldwin's government almost immediately capitulated to Italian aggression. Within days of arriving in office, the new British Foreign Secretary Samuel Hoare was engaged in talks with his French counterpart Pierre Laval who was also the French Prime Minister at the time, about how the war could be quickly brought to an end. Here, the desire to appease Italy and prevent it from drifting closer to Nazi Germany was paramount, and the Haile-Laval Pact, details of which were leaked by the British press in early December, effectively outlined a plan whereby Abyssinia would lose roughly half of its territory to Italy, allowing the Italians to connect their colonies of Eritrea and Somaliland. This was completely unacceptable to Selassie's government and a complete betrayal of the mandate of the League of Nations. Outrage followed. Haile resigned as British Foreign Minister, and ultimately the revelation of details of the pact brought to an end any efforts to find a diplomatic solution to the conflict. The Haile-Laval Pact and the wider Abyssinia crisis is generally seen as also sounding the death knell of the League of Nations, an institution which had now conclusively proven its inability to prevent aggressive nations like Italy and the Empire of Japan from invading its enemies with no justification. With the termination of diplomatic negotiations in December 1935, the war intensified on the ground in Abyssinia. By now, the Ethiopian government was making preparations for its own counter-offensive against the Italian incursion in the north. This was led by Selassie in person and had hoped to sever the Italian lines of communication and launch a counter-invasion of Eritrea. Initially, it met with considerable success, but in the early months of 1936, the tide turned once General Pietro Badoglio, who had previously overseen the Italian campaign in Libya, was appointed as governor of Eritrea and the leader of the military effort in succession to Debono, whose oversight of the invasion had been deemed too cautious by Mussolini. Badoglio initiated a brutal campaign in January 1936 in which poison gas was widely used against the Ethiopian armies. Through these methods, a series of victories were quickly won by Badoglio at the battles of Tembien, Amba Aradam and Shire in northern Ethiopia in the late winter and early spring of 1936. A final effort to maintain the northern front by Selassie was defeated at the Battle of Mechu on the 31st of March 1936, following which northern Ethiopia was effectively under Italian control. On the 26th of April 1936, Badoglio launched what he termed the March of the Iron Will, a swift drive southwards from the northern front around Dessie in Wollo province towards the Abyssinian capital of Addis Ababa, a distance of some 200 kilometers. The campaign was accompanied by much fanfare and propaganda in the fascist media back home in Italy. A large mechanized column was the centerpiece of this drive, with over 2,000 tanks, cars, trucks and other vehicles included in the operation, which transported some 12,500 Italian troops speedily towards Selassie's capital. By now, the Ethiopian armies were decimated from the northern offensive, and as the Italians neared Addis Ababa in early May, the emperor and his family fled from the capital and made their way towards the border with French Somaliland, crossing over as Selassie went into what would be years of exile from his realm. 3 days later, at roughly 4 p.m. on the afternoon of the 5th of May 1936, Badoglio arrived in Addis Ababa at the front of a column of 1,700 vehicles. In the hours that followed, Italian troops began entering the city in what was more of a procession than an actual siege, and occupied prominent buildings all over the capital. The war was now effectively over. The Second Italo-Ethiopian War came to an end in May 1936 with the fall of Addis Ababa and the flight of Emperor Haile Selassie from Ethiopia. However, pockets of resistance remained, particularly in the south and west of the country, which were still unoccupied by any Italian forces. Accordingly, fighting would continue for months and years to come. Indeed, all of Abyssinia was never actually brought under effective Italian control. Yet from May 1936, the Italian government claimed to have won the war. As such, the new colony of Italian Ethiopia was declared to be in existence by Mussolini on the 9th of May 1936. However, this was soon annexed into the newly proclaimed colony of Italian East Africa, which incorporated Abyssinia, Eritrea, and Italian Somaliland, and which stretched all the way across the Horn of Africa, completing the ambition for Italy to create a contiguous colony here, 40 years after it had first been attempted in the mid-1890s. Here the Italians would impose a brutal form of colonial governance, following many of the quasi-genocidal policies which had been developed in Libya in the 1920s of confining thousands of people to concentration camps and favoring a divide-and-rule policy whereby the different ethnic peoples of Ethiopia were pitted against each other. With the Italians now largely in control of his country, Emperor Selassie made his way to Europe. His first mission was to present Abyssinia's case at the League of Nations in Geneva. However, his timing was far from propitious. In Europe, Nazi Germany had initiated an aggressive program of military rearmament in 1935, and in the spring of 1936, while Selassie was fighting in northern Ethiopia, Hitler had ordered his troops into the Rhineland of Western Germany, which German troops had been prevented from entering under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, the treaty that brought the First World War to an end. Consequently, the governments of Britain and France were no more willing to adopt an aggressive stance against Italy in 1936 than they had been the previous autumn. Nevertheless, while his efforts at redress were in vain, Selassie gained acclaim for a speech he made at a meeting of the League on the 12th of May 1936. In the course of which he denounced the rise of fascism and the use of poison gas by the Italians in East Africa. He was subsequently named Time magazine's Man of the Year, but the result for Ethiopia was the same. The League was unwilling to take concerted action against Italy, which in any event withdrew from membership of it in December 1937. Meanwhile, Selassie headed for England, where he would live in exile throughout the late 1930s. While he was in exile in England, the world's politics was in continual flux. Germany's aggression intensified in 1938 with the annexation of Austria and then Czechoslovakia in 1939. When the Nazis invaded Poland the following September, Britain and France declared war, triggering the start of the Second World War. For the time being, Mussolini adopted a cautious stance and did not enter the war. But when the Germans undertook a blistering military campaign in the summer of 1940 that effectively brought continental Western Europe under Berlin's control, the Italians decided to side with Hitler, declaring war on Britain and France on the 10th of June 1940, and invading southeastern France in an effort to acquire territory there. What this now meant was that the Italians and the British would square off to each other in East Africa. On the 13th of June 1940, an Italian air raid was launched against British Kenya in the first action of the East Africa campaign. This was all part of a wider Italian initiative to conquer Britain's colonies in Egypt and Sudan, and thus unite Italy.